Good evening. This is Alicia Benson, and I wanted to talk to you briefly about racism. Racism is a broad topic, and so I'm going to talk specifically about the definition of racism, the history of racism in the United States. I'm going to talk about the cost of racism in America, and then 10 ways to combat racism. And then finally, I'm going to end with a question for you to consider. First, racial disparities still exist in education, criminal sentencing, employment, and political representation. Racism can be defined as a system of advantage based on race. Racism is a set of institutional, cultural, and interpersonal patterns and practices that create advantages for people legally defined and socially constructed as white. Conversely, disadvantages belong to people defined as non white or people of color. The United States has a history of racism from the broken treaties and stolen land experienced by Native Americans to Africans being taken from their land and forced to provide unpaid labor, to the redefined borders as a result of war for Mexicans. This racism continued in the United States with the recruitment and then abuse and exploitation of Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino workers in mines and railroads. And all of the people of color mentioned enabled the expansion of U.S. wealth and power to all parts of the world. One of the recent movements, Black Lives Matters, was created by three Black women to address police brutality against Blacks. And as a result of this movement, many alliances have been formed with other groups and organizations to address racism as it relates to the police. Racism is different from racial prejudice because it involves not just individual ideology, but it is a system involving cultural messages, institutional policies and practices, and actions of individuals. In the United States, this system works to the advantage of whites and to the disadvantage of people of color. There is a cost of racism in America and not just for Blacks. It negatively affects the American economy. For example, productivity is lowered due to tension in the workplace or real estate equity loss through housing discrimination. Also, tax revenue is lost due to underemployment of people of color. And finally, the high cost of housing people of color in the prison system make racism too expensive in America. 10 ways to combat racism include becoming aware of privilege and internalized racism, building intentional relationships based on equality, studying and discussing the history of people of color, challenging the evidence of white supremacy all around us, examining your home for evidence of a variety of cultures, challenging the evidence of white supremacy in your family life, inventory activism in the community where you live, intentionally building a base for activism at work, as well as intentionally building a base for activism at maybe church or other places that you like to go, like the gym. Keeping your eyes and heart open to new relationships and conversations about race, class, and gender. And finally, I want to leave you guys with the question: if racism was allowed to perpetuate generation after generation because people of color were dehumanized and viewed as racially inferior by others, how do African Americans change this narrative for themselves? Thank you for listening.